I'd like to take a few moments to explain why use cases are essential, and also why they can be dangerous. Let's start out with the pluses. Use cases are intended to make certain that products deliver value to the user. Products like this may be rare in the physical world, but they are pretty common when it comes to software. The bottom line is that use cases specify what a system needs to do in order to deliver value and communicate these requirements to developers. Use cases can also shorten delivery time and reduce cost. For example, it costs a whole lot more to change the watering can design after the molds have been made. This is a gram of prevention instead of a kilogram of cure. It's measure twice, cut once. This effect was measured by Barry Boehm in 1981 and revisited in 2000. Boehm found that for a given project scope, analyst skill is the single most important factor in development effort. Good analysts cut development effort in half. I think this is just a reflection of the value of well-understood requirements, and that's what use cases are for. In fact, the bigger the effort is, the more it needs good requirements. This example is by no means the most egregious. It's not all roses. Use cases have a dark side too. One problem is that there's very little consensus on what ought to be in a use case. Some people want the entire world in their use cases, and that's not enough for other people. Here's an example of a UML model of very detailed use cases. This came from the Smart Grid effort. I know you can't read it. Please just compare it to the next slide, which shows a much simpler UML model that can be satisfactory for some purposes. You can get even simpler, like these user stories on sticky notes. So use cases today are like the elephant perceived by blind men. Everybody has a different take on what use cases should be like. Another problem with use cases is analysis paralysis. The more detailed the use cases are, the greater this danger becomes. Yet another problem is just how useful the use cases are after they've been constructed. Wiggins here has produced an enormous volume of text. Unfortunately, he achieved it through needless redundancy. I would argue that many use cases are afflicted with unhelpful detail. That may help explain why some Smart Grid use cases are 1 page long, while this one is 151 pages. Maybe Wiggins wrote it. And lastly, we run into a very serious black and white question. Black boxes have hidden inner details. White boxes reveal their inner details. If this was a use case, it would be a black box use case. It shows what the thing does, not what happens inside. Specifying what happens inside is bad, because if you specify a clock that's powered by gravitational potential energy and regulated by a pendulum, you rule out a clock that's small enough to wear on your wrist. After all, it's hard to drag around the weights in the pendulum. You rule out an anniversary clock, powered by a spring, regulated by a torsional pendulum that can run 400 days on a single winding. You also rule out a clock that synchronizes itself automatically with the NIST time signal. Of course, the digital display would also be eliminated if you describe the clock interface in terms of a dial instead of describing the functionality. Describing the GUI too closely also rules out the metric clock that divides the day into 10 metric hours, each composed of 100 metric minutes divided into 100 metric seconds, and the uncomfortable clock that rotates counterclockwise. Maybe we're better off without these last two anyway. The bottom line here is that describing the GUI too tightly can also impair innovation. My opinion is that internal detail should not be shown. Use cases should describe how the user gets value from the system, what the user perceives and does. Because what happens internally is an implementation detail, and implementation details really don't belong in requirements. There are plenty of other problems as well. This additional list isn't complete either, and despite all of these shortcomings, use cases can still have extraordinary value.